Hey, Shalom, Akim, Shalom, Shalom, giving all praises, glory and honor to Yahweh, Ba'ashem Yahushai, Ba'ashem Akakwadash. Double honors the apostles and the elders of Great Millstone for teaching us truth and citations to the sincere Akim and Akwath and listen. May the blessing of election be upon your house. My name is Raquai. I'm back in here with another quick and Lord's will as always an edifying lesson. And for today's lesson, I wanted to talk about how you would have Israelites that basically will look like the um, the other nations, right? Not every Israelite is going to look like a so-called black person, woolly hair, afro, basically the Denzel Washington type of look, right? You're not gonna have that. A lot of the Israelites going to look like the different very heathen nations that they were scattered, right? And that is one of the curses that fell upon our people, that we would basically be scattered into the four corners of the earth, and then we would serve other gods, right? So what happens in a process of time, you would have children that start to take on the vibration, take on the customs, the culture of the nations that they were scattered, and start to look like even the nations where they were scattered, right? And I wanted to do this because, like, this is something that a lot of Christians, so-called Christians, have a very, very, very hard time receiving. And the easiest thing for them to do is to scoff, right? And we know ultimately, yes, the scriptures do say that in the last days there would be scoffers, but at the same time, it shows how unlearned they are. It shows how um they can't, it's very hard to receive it, as Paul said it himself. If the gospel be hidden, then to them are lost, right? So let me get the curses first. And I sincerely I sincerely pray that this lesson is edifying. Real quick, let me get Deuteronomy 28 verse 64. And it says this, and it says, "And the Lord Yahweh shall scatter thee among all people, and from one end of the earth even unto the other. And there thou shalt serve other gods, which neither thou nor thy fathers have known, even wood and stone." So even in a process of time, this curse fell upon our people. And eventually Jake settles, and they start to dwell with the other nations, dwell among the other nations, and eventually they start to take the women of the other nations. This is why I have this image on the screen here, because this image is basically, it's a very, very good show. It's called Dragon Ball Z, for brothers who don't know. But ultimately, when you watch the show, you'll see that there's two primary main characters in this show. And the first one of the main characters on the show here is on the top. His name is Vegeta. So they're from this planet, right? This foreign planet known as, I believe it's called Planet Vegeta in the show. And, they ended up fleeing and moving to this other planet, called Earth. And both of the two main characters, they basically, in the show, they eventually took wives. So they took wives of the women of the other planet known as Earth in the show, right? And what happens? They bring forth children, right? And one of the children you see from this main character is below here. So he has more of the features. His name is Trunks. He has more of the features of his mother, right? Let's call her a so-called Earth woman, right? But when you look at the show spiritually, you'll see that the concept of the sons of God, as it describes in Genesis 6, is very much seen within this show. The children started looking like a lot more like the other nations, right? They started looking more like so-called earthlings, I'll say it like that. But the bloodline, the seed, ultimately still goes back to the man, right? The man is who is the sex that carries both the X and the Y chromosome. That's where, you know, um, He is the one that carries and continues the lineage, right? And this is a stronghold that a lot of our so-called Christians can't receive, is that you'll have Israelites that will look like, the other nations where they were scattered, right? The scriptures talk about how a spiritual man, judgeth all things, and he that is natural have a hard time to receive the things of the spirit, to roughly paraphrase, because a lot of our people are very, very natural because they can't receive what is actually being spoken, to them through the Lord's prophets, right? Through the Lord's voice. So to receive those things, the quick thing for them to do is to easily scoff, mock, right? Say black Hebrew Israelites, which really there really is no such thing, because nobody on this planet is black, right? We're all different shades of brown. That's one stronghold, right? So this is the purpose of this lesson, is to basically tear down those strongholds and understand that you will have Israelites, looking like the other nations, right? Let me get this in Sirach, actually. This is Sirach chapter 21, verse 15. And it says, if a skillful man hear a wise word, he will commend it and add unto it. But as soon as one of no understanding heareth it, it displeaseth him, and he cast it behind his back. So the quickest thing for a lot of our people who are so-called Christians, or so-called followers of vocab alone, or, just basically adversaries, you know, um, one of the easiest things for them to do is to basically label, call, the camps, so-called Black Hebrew Israelites, which there really is no thing. There is no such thing, right? Because they're just being a scoffer, and it shows that you don't understand history. When you go into the different empires, what I just read before, of the Israelites being scattered, look how vast those empires were when you really think about it. And I'll just use one as an example. When you read the book of Esther, which takes place during the Achaemenid Empire, also known as the Empire of the Persians and the Medes, right? When you look at that empire, it was extremely vast. There was 127 provinces. So imagine Jake from all different facets working. It could be working as fishermen, or they can be working as servitor in the court, like our forefather Mordecai, for example. When you think about that, you think, man, Jake was all over the place, you know, Jake was all over the place. And ultimately, being around these other nations, they started to take on a lot of the vibrations of the other nations, the customs, the culture. It's the same thing when they moved to here in America. Their children start to celebrate Halloween. Their children start to celebrate Christmas, or they start to celebrate Canada Day and this holiday and that holiday. It's the same thing in the ancient times. You know, let me go here. And what happens? They start to lose fragments of the culture. The culture starts to become more fragmented. And then they start to forget, right? Their own path, their own way. Let's get this here. Let's go dive back a bit into some history. This is Nehemiah chapter 13, verse 23. And this is during the time of the rebuilding. Nehemiah was one of our righteous forefathers, helping to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, right? And walls really symbolize protection. And during this time, Nehemiah faced a lot of rebuke. I don't want to say rebuke, sorry, that's not the right word. He faced a lot of opposition. He had a lot of adversaries against, him actually rebuilding the walls, ridicule from the other nations, right? He even had to rebuke, I should say, some of the, what's it called, the some elders that would commit usury. But nevertheless, just to get an understanding of what's going on during this time, this is Nehemiah 13 and verse 23, and it says, in those days Also, saw I Jews that had married wives of Ashdod, of Ammon, and of Moab. And the children spake half in the speech of Ashdod, and could not speak in the Jews' language, which was the ancient Hebrew, but according to the language of each people. And I contended with them, and cursed them, and smote certain of them, and plucked off their hair, and made them swear by the Most High Yahweh Bashim Shai, saying, Ye shall not give your daughters to their sons, nor take their daughters unto your sons and for yourselves. Verse 26. Did not King Solomon, king of Israel, sin by these things? And it wasn't because he sinned. The sin wasn't the fact that he had multiple wives. That wasn't the sin. The sin was the fact that when you go through the Kings in the 11th chapter, it describes how he waxed old and eventually started paying reference to those other gods. You know, the women that worshipped those other gods. I believe Chemosh was one of them. Ashtaroth, that's the god of the, if I'm not mistaken, the Canaanites, if I'm not mistaken, right? And all these different gods have their own practices. All these gods have their own filthy, abominable practices, which is contrary to the way we're supposed to live, because we're supposed to be a holy and a separate people. Continuing on in verse 26, yet among many nations was there no king like him, for he was beloved of his power Yahweh, and the Most High made him king over all Israel. Nevertheless, even him did outlandish women cause him to sin. Shall we then hearken unto you to do this great evil, to transgress against our power in marrying strange wives, right? So you're not supposed to be marrying the women of the other nations, right? You take on the vibration and it causes you and your children to sin, right? It's the same thing what Jake does today. They travel to this place, they start to dress like the other nations, they take the women of the other nations. They're supposed to be a concubine, right? And if I'm not mistaken, I believe it's during the time of when you deal with a concubine, she's supposed to put off the raiment of her captivity. So for example, in the ancient times, she would pare her nails and shave her hair, right? And mourn for a certain amount of time, right? And she's supposed to come under you, not the other way around. But Jake's problem is that they start to take on the covering of the other nations rather than the covering of the Lord, right? So just to show an example, so imagine that they spoke about they lost parts of the Jews' language. So think about what else did they lose? The way of dress, the certain laws. You start eating, you start to eat like the other nations. This is why a lot of so-called Christians have a very hard time understanding Paul's writings. For example, when he says, you were Gentiles carried away after dumb idols, you know, understanding these things also requires to understand the history of what happened to our people. And then the end result is you're going to have a lot of Israelites that look like the other nations. I'll give an example, personal testimony. I have a what's it called? A coworker. He looks like a so-called Chinese person, but when you see his behavior, he behaves like a Jake. And as a matter of fact, that's one of the things you'll notice too. It's funny. A lot of the other Israelites that look like the other nations, they're always hanging around Jake all the time. The scriptures talk about how birds flock to their kind, right? So the scripture, it's really important to remain spiritual, and understand a lot of history in regards to what happened to our people. We're not limited. Our people are so simple because they think nationality is tied to a landmass, right? So let me get that actually in regards to Paul's writings. One second. This is 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 15. The point's really in 16, and it says, an account that the long suffering of our Lord is salvation, even as to our beloved brother Paul, also according to the wisdom given unto him, hath written unto you, as also in his epistles, speaking in them of things which in which are some things hard to be understood, which they are unlearned and unstable, rest as they do also the other scriptures unto their own destruction. So our people can't, so-called Christians have a hard time receiving this. How do you explain, Israelites that, they're calling upon the name of the Lord, they're seeking the Lord, and they look like the other nations? How do you explain that? You know what I'm saying? They're not all going to look like Denzel. They're not all going to look like Eddie Murphy. They're not all going to look like Halle Berry. You're going to have Israelites that look like, the main character from Home Alone. You're going to have some Israelites that look like Bruce Lee. You know what I'm saying? Look like all the other nations where they were scattered. That's why Paul said, you were Gentiles, carried away after carried away after dumb idols. You know, because you started taking on the culture, the Greekish fashion. Because that's the empire that ruled before Rome was ancient Greece. Alexander, he reigned 12 years and he died, and eventually his generals came and there was wars and wickedness began to multiply, right? And they started to disregard their customs. They started to worship Bacchus, Bacchanalia. That's a common thing that our people still celebrate to this day. you know those things are very important to know, and then to understand certain Paul's writings, and to understand why a lot of Israelites will look like the nations where they were scattered, right? And it's very important to remain spiritual too, within these things, right? Let's get this. It's First Corinthians. First Corinthians 2, verse 14. And it says, but the natural man receiveth not the things of the Spirit of the Most High, for they are foolishness unto him, neither can he know them, because they are spiritually discerned. But he that is spiritual judgeth all things, but he himself is judged of no man, right? So it's very important to remain, spiritual. You know, look at Michael Jackson. Oh, that's a good example. Look at Michael Jackson's children. And when you watch this show, you'll see that. You'll see the fact that they're known as the Saiyans in the show. They married the women of the other nations, and eventually what happened is then their children eventually began to marry the children of that same nations where they settled, right? So eventually, but it still goes back to a seed line. That's really the point here, right? So they start to look like they take on the features and the culture. They start to eat like them. They start to behave like them. Another good example is Lion King. When you watch that show spiritually in the first part, Simba, he started to hang around the wild hog and the meerkat, and he started eating like the meerkat because he didn't even know he was a lion. When you watch the show, sorry, the movie, it's so interesting. He says, one of the main characters says, he's like, lion. You know, the meerkat was more in had the mind. Oh, that's a lion. I'm supposed to fear him, right? But Simba didn't know who he was, right? So he thought that was not an he thought that was a friend, rather than actually thinking that was a foe, right? So it shows you a process in time, what happens to our people when they scattered amongst the other nations, right? Dressing like them, behaving like them, you know, eating like them, so worshiping their gods and their holidays and so on and so forth, right? So Let me get this here in Corinthians. 2 Corinthians 10, verse 3, and it says, "For though we walk in the flesh, we do not war after the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty through the Most High, Yahweh Bashem Shai, to the pulling down of strongholds, casting down imaginations, and every high thing that exalteth against itself, against the knowledge of the Most High, and bringing into captivity every thought to the obedience of a Mashiach, Yahweh Shai." So we tear down these strongholds. We're not black Hebrew Israelites. You know what I'm saying? You can't say that. And then you have brothers, sisters. I've met Israelite foreigners in the world, and they've had dreams about having their dark skin. True story. You know, they always have, all these, dreams. And when you talk to them about their history, and when you understand history as well, some of them were in Scotland. Some of them were in Nova Scotia. When you understand, the diaspora, when you understand Jake's, where we were and we conquered, and understand prophecy as well, then you under a bigger understanding, and you're able to make more spiritual, healthier judgments. But our people have a very hard time understanding these things and receiving these things because they're very unlearned, right? So, you know, I just wanted to, just make a quick lesson in regards to this because, it doesn't take much to understand that, when Jake takes the women of the other nations, the children are going to start to look like the women of, start to going to look like the nations where they were scattered, right? So, but it still ultimately goes back to a specific seed line of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But, I just thought I would just make this quick lesson. Lord's will, this lesson was just quick and edifying. Just like to give all praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh Bashem El Shai. Until next time, I say Shalom.